Perfect. Thank you, Nivas. So thank you for having me on the event. I'm so excited to chat with Elad. Lots to talk about, so hopefully we can cram a lot of that content in the next 40 minutes or so. For a quick context, I'm the Chief Business Officer at Hopin, so if you have any technical support questions, email me directly. So hopefully you're enjoying the platform. Prior life, I spent time at Google, Dropbox, Salesforce, and RelateIQ. But now focusing on making all these virtual events as successful as possible. But let's focus on Elad. So Elad is a serial entrepreneur, operating executive and investor, and he's an advisor of several private companies that you know, Airbnb, Pinterest, Square, and Stripe. Elad also spent some time at Twitter, where he ran various teams, Geo and Search. And also, he was early at Google, although we didn't work together at that time. He was working on all aspects of mobile, including a few acquisitions, like one that you will probably know, Android. And also worked on mobile maps and a few other mobile products. So with that, Elad, let's jump right into it. So you were an advisor investor in Airbnb when there were 10 people. Were still sounded pretty crazy as an opportunity. So you've been known to see things and to look ahead of what's going on. We're right now in the middle of COVID, or hopefully towards the end of COVID, but still figuring out how what this means for the new normal. What are you seeing ahead?
Yeah, so first off, thanks so much for the conversation today, and many thanks to Freshworks and Nivas for including me today. I think fundamentally, when I think about the impact of COVID, it feels like the whole economy is kind of split into two. And you actually see this in the performance of the S&P and other things. The main reason the S&P 500 is up is because a handful of large tech companies have really driven market cap up, while a lot of the sort of traditional atoms and bits economy has really faltered or has really suffered. And so it's almost like we have this split or schizophrenic situation right now in the economy. And I think that's also reflected in the startup world. And fundamentally, in the startup world, I feel like there are companies that have clearly accelerated due to COVID. Instacart would be one example. Patrick Collison, the CEO of Stripe, has tweeted about how Stripe is really rapidly added business since COVID. And so there's a set of companies that have clearly benefited. And some of those I think will benefit sustainably. Some of those I think will lose traction once COVID snaps back. And then on the other side of it, there's companies that have clearly been hurt. Like anything in travel is obviously really hurt and devastated by COVID. And similarly there, I think there'll be companies that 2 years from now will still be a great company and will come back and truck along, and other companies that will never snap back. And so it's almost this 2x2 matrix of, was it positively impacted, negatively impacted, and then it's sustainable or not sustainable. And so that's really the lens I use when I think about COVID and the current landscape as well as the post-COVID landscape. And there's things that are clearly accelerating around remote work tools and vertical SaaS, food delivery, payments online, all sorts of things like that. And then obviously there's things, online education, online healthcare, and then there's things that are clearly really being hurt right now in terms of retail.
Yeah, so I saw that 2x2 in your blog post a couple of months ago now, talking about startup offense and defense. So let's jump more into that. You start with defense and how startups think about their options in this environment. Can you walk us through that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think there's a set of moves that you can make almost defensively, which is, make sure your business is on a stable footing, that your customer base isn't impacted by COVID, that your employees are happy. Those are really the core components that you have to think about, is almost like, are you well capitalized to make it? Are your customers in good shape? And then are your employees happy or content and productive? And so I think you kind of go through each of those from a money perspective. How much runway do you have? How long will it last? One thing that I didn't, I think, call properly was I thought basically we would have a period of exuberance over the summer, and then in the fall it would start to go away with the second wave of COVID. We'll still see what happens in terms of second wave. But I think if I look at the venture capital sort of investment cycle through COVID, March, basically the entire venture capital industry froze. Nobody was doing anything. April and May, VCs were basically focusing on companies that they were already involved with, that they were in their portfolio. All these preemptive financing rounds happened. June, they started looking at companies that weren't in their portfolio and started those conversations. And suddenly in July, August, it's this incredible exuberance in terms of financing rounds and valuations and everything else, at least for a subset of companies. And things have come back much faster than I thought they ever would. And I think part of that is just driven by this sort of uptick in the public markets in parallel. And then I think part of it is some online businesses are just accelerated because, COVID has forced changes that normally would have taken 5 or 10 years in terms of enterprise adoption to suddenly occur in 6 months, right? Zoom adoption is a great example of that, where they jumped to hundreds of millions of users for tens of millions in just a few month period, which is incredible, right? In terms of adoption, that normally would have taken them 5 years. And so you see that with some of the private companies as well. So, so one is, do you have enough money to last? And so you can do all the math around runway and everything else. Now is actually a very good time to raise money, so I suggest people do that. 2 is, from a customer-based perspective, you can go through your customers and say who's likely to be impacted going forward, and if so, how does that impact your own projections of revenue? Or can you double down on verticals that are doing very well and maybe spend less time in travel or other areas that are doing badly? And then lastly, on the employee side, I think a lot of people are struggling right now with, if half of your new employees have never worked with anybody else in a physical office, how do you onboard them properly? How do you build ties between team members? How do you really start to create a way to have still a cohesive culture and a cohesive team and onboard people? And so I think those are the main things people are struggling with.
I would love to go into remote work a little bit later, but staying on the talent side, in the post you talked about this is a great time to go and hire people. If you're in the position to do that. So you talked about, hey, if you're in trouble, you let go of folks, just one time, do it properly, and then start growing from there. But you also talk about hiring. Have you seen that pan out, opportunities to hire people in tech, or is it that the market is so exuberant that talent is still as competitive as always? Or have you seen people do those cuts and then there's a lot of talent to go after?
Yeah. I think talent is definitely competitive, but the flip side of it is there are a number of companies that have done large layoffs and will continue to sort of cut people. But also, I think there's some really extraordinary people that you can go after now. And a lot of things in some sense are easier in COVID. First of all, you don't have to worry about people traveling on site. So they don't have to leave work in the middle of the day to travel for an hour and then go meet you. If you're recruiting from a different geography, you're recruiting a new CFO and you're talking to people in New York or whatever it may be, they don't have to fly out, so it doesn't become a big trip and a plan and let's wait 2 weeks. And so I actually see some of the hiring cycles, particularly for executives, happening a bit faster because suddenly all the travel is gone from people's schedules. So it's much easier actually to pull people in for the conversation. And then I think people, in some cases, feel a little bit less affinity to their workplace. In some cases, obviously, it's stronger. But in some cases, it's weaker simply because you're not in the office every day. You don't see your coworkers that you've used friends every day. You don't really have those personal connections. And at the same time, everybody's rethinking everything. Where should I be based long-term? Should I move? Am I doing the right role? Am I happy in life? There are these big existential questions. It's almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs is being revisited. And so I do think that that creates some vulnerability in terms of the ability to recruit people or to coax them into a conversation that maybe they wouldn't have had if they were just running, nonstop and traveling and doing all sorts of things that are very hard to sort of break out of. So I think people have a lot more sort of headspace for certain things in a subset of cases.
That's super interesting. I haven't heard much being written talking about that, how people are losing that connection with the companies because they're not there, they're not with their friends, they're not having lunch together and spending all those hours face to face. We have a lot of startups that are building their companies and they're building them as remote teams. Anything you've seen that works well to counterbalance that and create that affinity or culture, that family feel, team feel, without an office?
Yeah, I've seen people take a few different approaches. So one approach, for example, is scheduling a random lunch between people on the same team once a week, or other ways to sort of enforce some form of social interaction or one-on-one or conversations. So I think one piece is how do you create bonds between people? Some companies that are on the smaller side I've also seen start to do an optional work together on Mondays from like a park or something else outside, and they'll wear masks and they'll try and ensure that people are safe and all the rest of it. But they'll actually say it's optional, but if you want, come and you'll see people live and you'll get to actually work with people for a 4-hour chunk or whatever sort of chunk they put aside. So I've seen some people do that on a weekly basis. And I think it's very geography dependent in terms of the number of people participate. SF tends to be more conservative, other areas tend to be less so. And then I've also seen people try and do like online small group mixers or happy hours, or send everybody a drink of their choice so that everybody can get online and it's kind of fun and interesting and you can talk about it. So I think there's lots of different attempts to create that social cohesion and those bonds. I do think it is harder if you don't have people in place together.
So the move, everybody working from home, is that something that you think is going to continue, or we're going to revert quickly to as soon as we can go back to the office, everybody's going to go back to the office?
Yeah, I think it's largely going to revert with some exceptions. And it's kind of interesting because there was a lot of discussion around remote work before COVID. And obviously we're forcing everybody to do it now. And at the time, if you think about it, there's only a very, very small number of companies that ever pulled it off, right? GitLab, and by pull it off, I mean hit a few hundred people or more as a remote first or remote only company. And so GitLab is one, right? There are 1,000 plus people now. Zapier, I think, is somewhere in the hundreds. I don't know for sure, but that's my sense. Automatic, which drives WordPress, is another. But after that, I can't really think of many. It's not a long list. And so the default state was centralization, or at least some home office. And I think after COVID, that's going to be the case too. I do think some people will want more flexibility after having gone through that period. Days a week in the office, and 1 day work from home. Some people are going to try hybrid approaches. But in reality, I think most companies end up either being truly fully remote. And again, there's only a handful of them. It's not that many companies that have pulled it off outside of COVID. Or I think they're going to have some centralization, and then maybe they'll have a subset of the workforce remote. And then, the standard pattern is you just have, a few different offices in other places as well. But being remote, I think, comes with a lot of overhead, a lot of process that you can usually delay as a fast-growing startup. And COVID right now is enforcing those processes. And so a company at 40 people is adopting processes that a 400-person company would have had to adopt. Just so there's communication and goal setting and alignment and all the things that with 40 people you can kind of walk around.
We're seeing exactly that at Hopin. We added over 100 people in the last couple months through, we're at 28 different countries right now. So as a company, we'll never have one office for sure. And we're definitely maturing way faster than other startups I've been a part of. But it comes with a lot of trade-offs. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Yeah.
Sure. Going back to the topic, right, being offensive or defense in this scenario, you also talk about M&A as an opportunity right now. Have you seen that play out in the last couple of months, or do you see that's going to accelerate? What have you seen on that front?
Yeah, I feel like there's 3 or 4 different paths to M&A. There's or different levels. There's buying a team. There's buying a product or product whole that you can then easily cross-sell. There's buying an asset or a unique property. That's like Facebook buying Instagram. There's only one Instagram. And then there's doing roll-ups or consolidating a market segment. I think each type of acquisition is going to have its moment over the coming year or 18 months or however long you think COVID is going to last. And I think part of it is just how do public markets do and what does the funding environment look like? In today's current environment where funding has suddenly become easier again over the last month or so, and obviously every month is like a year or something right now, I think some of the most interesting buys are if you're in an industry that has old economy analogs or offline analogs, this is a wonderful time to buy some of those businesses. And so if you're doing telehealth, but you'd really like a chain of in-person offices, or you sort of name the market vertical, there may be really interesting outsized opportunities to pick things up very cheaply with the assumption that you lose money on them for 1 to 2 years, and then it becomes a booming business again. And so I do think there are going to be a set of assets in certain segments that are going to be really mispriced. And if you're looking to do a hybrid model or have certain types of assets, this is a great time to buy those. I think in terms of team M&A, I think there's actually lots of opportunities for that, because I do think that the follow-on rounds have become a little bit more discerning on the early stage side. I think there's lots and lots of seed activity. You still see some bridges, but I think those are getting harder for some companies. And so there may be some more M&A opportunities there. And then I do think that there's a lot of companies that have been around for a while that may now be impacted negatively by COVID, not because they're a bad company, but simply because COVID is so impactful to certain verticals. And in those circumstances, you may actually be able to do a roll-up of certain assets or really buy interesting companies. And so, it really depends on the market segment and your situation, but I think there's really interesting opportunities.
It's not only look at tech peers or people in different verticals within the tech space, but you're thinking like physical assets. If you're Airbnb and you ever thought about owning hotels, this might be the best time to go and do something like that.
Yeah. This would be a good time to look at things like that. Or your Airbnb, and I don't have any knowledge of their M&A roadmap or what they're going to do or not do, but your Airbnb and maybe all these travel assets are suddenly cheap temporarily. And so can you go and roll up really interesting things in your market segment?
So you also talk about building moats at this moment or repositioning yourself for this context. Can you talk more about that? What opportunities have startups to do that today? How will you approach that systematically?
Yeah, I think a number of companies I know are taking the moment as well to just say we're going to rebuild or deepen infrastructure. So if their parts of their team are less busy, sometimes they have them focus on things like that, like how do we strengthen our core or rebuild certain things so they're modular so we can now use them in different ways. I think that some people are also just taking a look at what segments do they want to be in long term. And I've seen some companies retrench or withdraw from international markets or other things and then double down in the US or do different things like that. So I think there's lots of different ways to refocus. During COVID, I think in parallel for an early stage company, one early stage company I was helping out informally was doing something in travel, and they decided, the next 2 years, we're just not going to make any headway here. So let's just go do something else. And so I've seen some companies purposefully pivot into new areas simply so that they have an area to survive in, because eventually they'll run out of money if they just stick to what they're doing. I've also seen companies reposition their marketing materials. So maybe you have a tool for enterprises and you go from emphasizing collaboration and certain uses to emphasizing ROI and cost savings, and this helps your Fortune 500 team be more productive in these 3 ways, And so I've seen marketing copy shift, I've seen product feature shift, and then I've seen entire pivots, and all those things I think make sense.
I'm betting a few of the entrepreneurs listening are thinking, okay, I could go enterprise, but that's always been the challenge. There's so many things I have to get right, and that's the signal I get when I go to enterprise is delayed, right? Because I have to do all this work and then run all these deals, and then eventually I might get some buying signal. How should they approach that? How do you should think about it?
Yeah, it's interesting because the longer the sales cycle on something, it either suggests a harder customer base or a less valuable product. And that isn't always true. And it depends on what you mean by enterprise. Because, when people talk about enterprise, sometimes I feel that there's 3 segments that really fall out of it. There's the SMB segment, which explicitly is an enterprise, but that's the 100,000 small businesses or the 1 million small businesses or whatever it is. And then you have mid-market. And mid-market in some cases are actually very large companies that can spend $100,000 to a few $100,000 a year on a piece of software, but they're not going to have the same incredibly long lead time as something like a Fortune 1000 company, which is often at the top of the sort of enterprise pyramid. And so I should have said mid-market and enterprise when I made the statement enterprise, to your point. Some enterprise sales just de facto are going to be long because you're dealing with a giant organization and it's a complex sale. But sometimes you can get much faster sales going in the mid-market, and then you can move up into enterprise. I have seen 1 or 2 companies now actually have very fast sales cycle in enterprise. And in some cases, it's just a burning need product. So, you just pay for it. I've seen that recently in security and a few other areas. And in some cases, it takes longer, to your point.
So I know we don't have a ton of time, so I want to narrow it down a little bit. So we're talking about some companies doing different things and different verticals behaving different ways. What are the sectors that you're saying, okay, this is, or specific companies that you say, hey, these are exciting companies that right, we should all be looking at?
Yeah, I think, do you mean in the COVID context or outside of COVID?
I think more in the 2020 context, with everything involved, not just people that are, companies are accelerating because of COVID, but people that are going to do well 2020, 2021, 2022.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I think one of the biggest shifts that's happening right now in the enterprise, and by enterprise again, I mean IT software for mid-market and enterprise and stuff like that, is the emergence of a combination of no-code, low-code, and RPA. And that's companies like Airtable, Notion, Retool, Parabola, Simpo, et cetera. And in those cases, you basically have these companies which are enabling any person in that organization to build tooling or retool dashboard or whatever it may be. And so it's really that's one piece of the puzzle where you can build applications on top of a database or a spreadsheet like representation of a database like what Airtable has. And then on the other side of that, there's RPA, or robotic process automation, which is basically, when all is said and done, building APIs on top of old enterprise software. So UiPath's canonical use case is invoice data extraction, where you basically have a folder on your desktop of a bunch of PDFs of invoices, and you sort of program it to extract the data and input it into an old school enterprise system like a SAP or somebody else that doesn't have very good APIs. And so if you think about it, you have APIs that you can programmatically build as just an average user, and then you have apps that you can build. And so you can tie these things together now in very interesting ways. And so I think a really big shift that's happening is the conversion of what traditionally was services revenue or services approaches, Accenture coming in and building you an ATS, into SaaS software, where you can build it yourself using some of these tools. I think that's a massive change that's going to play out over the next 5 to 10 years. And it's sort of one of the very big waves in enterprise software and in SaaS right now. So that's one area that I'm very excited about. The second area I'm very excited about is machine learning hardware. And obviously there's super interesting things happening with GPT-3 and other areas. And we can talk about those if interesting, but I actually think one of the things that often isn't focused on is the underlying hardware. And every big wave of technology has created a tens of billions of dollars semiconductor company. So you had Broadcom for networking, you had Intel for desktop compute and later server computes, you had NVIDIA for graphics processing, literally everything. Mobile, you had Qualcomm and ARM, right? So you have these big waves of technology, and underlying them, there's always a hardware shift. And right now, the dominant player in ML hardware or AI hardware is NVIDIA, but GPUs really aren't optimized for machine learning, right? If you think about what machine learning is, it's really just matrix multiplication. And you want something that allows you to do very fast matrix multiplication and then have good I/O. And GPUs really aren't optimized for that. And so there's a whole class of companies, Cerebras and Grok and other companies that are focused specifically on building hardware that's optimized for the ML world. And I think those are tens of billions of dollar opportunities. So I think that's a very exciting market segment.
What are you seeing on the consumer side?
Yeah, on the consumer side, even before COVID, I was very excited that there may be a potential social wave coming. And part of that is generational. I think that, every 5 years or so, you have to kind of turn over a subset of the network because people don't want to be on the network that their parents are on, kind of thing, at least initially, and then it always consolidates. And then it also felt like there were sort of niche areas or behaviors that could be captured. And in parallel, you have things like WebRTC and WebGL that I think really enable different types of collaboration and video and other things in a really rich context through the browser. So I am very bullish that something interesting will emerge in social. It's always impossible to predict, so who knows what it'll actually be.
So not TikTok, something else.
Yeah.
Not TikTok.
I'm sorry, say that again? Not TikTok. I mean, TikTok is now old enough, but obviously interesting. There's new interesting things like Clubhouse and other sort of applications that are emerging that I think are experimenting with with audio or certain types of video or other things like that. So I think that's a big interesting area. And there's also going to be the work versions of that, like those different people trying to build like a virtual office or a virtual conference room or things like that. That is obviously a very different use case, but I think there'll be productivity tools that have some collaboration features built in. It's kind of interesting because I remember in the first social wave in around 2010 or 2011, my company just got acquired by Twitter, and a lot of the conversation was, oh, the social enterprise and social collaboration enterprise and all these tools. And nothing really happened, right? Slack eventually came up, and at the time there was Yammer. But it really didn't happen in a way that everybody thought it would happen, nothing happened. And then you have tools like Figma suddenly arise, in part because of WebGL, where you truly have online collaboration in an enterprise context, right? And I think we're going to see both an acceleration of these collaboration tools around specific use cases, but I think we're also going to see more broad-based collaboration tools emerging. And so that's one aspect in some sense of like social products, but more SaaS social. And then I think there's going to be all the really interesting consumer social products that hopefully
I'm
emerging.
seeing a lot more of the virtual whiteboard use cases, like companies like Mural now taking off because people are like, hey, how do we have this conversation and share? And they go to Google Docs and it doesn't work. And then they end up collaborating very differently than what Yammer or Chatter from Salesforce, where I was, working.
Yeah, it's like the visual layer is now being added on top of these collaboration tools, and is creating a whole new rich set of interactions. And I think a lot of people are doing virtual offices, but I really think the virtual conference room is what's needed.
So let's shift a little bit. Let's go to your book, the High Growth Handbook, which highly recommend people should take a look. You talk about the role of the CEO in early stage startups. What things from the book should we apply now in this particular crisis? It's not a startup-driven crisis, but like a pandemic, global crisis. What things should we bring from that?
I think basically it's almost like everybody's instantly playing in the big leagues because there's so many stressors, right? There's COVID and remote work. If you think about it, almost everybody's having a bad day once a week or once a month. People get stressed out or upset, or they're dealing with kids at home or whatever it is. And so I feel like there's many more bad days per person. And so when you're managing your employee base, there's sort of that to take into account. There's onboarding people remotely. So it definitely feels like we're in the professional leagues version of, running a startup right now. I think there's a few things to keep in mind. Number one, all this stuff is temporary. I mean, at some point, COVID will go away. Maybe it's 12 months, maybe it's 18 months, but it's not 5 years. One way or the other, we're going to be done with it. So I think that's important to keep in mind in terms of context. And I think it's important to emphasize that to your team, to give people a sense of stability, surety, direction, clarity of their responsibilities, and also just, that reminder that everybody should be kind of treating each other well and giving people the benefit of the doubt. One of the two issues with remote work is, number one, you don't have a stronger relationship with some of your coworkers necessarily. And two is, since so much is done on Slack and email and other tools, tone and context is completely lost. So I'm sure we've all had that 20-minute flame war that was an innocuous comment that turned into some terrible thing, and feelings hurt and all, and it's completely unnecessary. And if that had been in person, it'd been like a 1-minute conversation about something else, right? And so I think everybody should remind themselves, hey, if that starts to happen, intervene, or say something nice to the person, everything's fine. Like people are pretty stressed right now. So
we're getting a few questions from attendees. So we'll jump into that until Nivas comes out and just pulls it out of the screen, which I know he can do with one click instead of having to push us out of the stage.
Yeah.
So one question that's coming in is, where do you see an urgent need or problem that startups could be working on, but a few companies seem to be entering into?
Yeah, well, a tough one, or two tough areas. One would be nuclear energy, or nuclear power. I think if we weren't in the middle of COVID, we would have a lot of emphasis right now on global warming, and I think people are starting to experience it more and more firsthand in terms of extreme weather in their own backyard kind of thing. I mean, that window behind me is normally clear, and San Francisco is now covered with a big dark smoke cloud. So that's a good example of it, although obviously that's also driven by California regulatory policy. I think it was a change 25 years ago where the rules around how you could remove fallen wood and lumber from your property or from public lands shifted. And so you now have these chunks of wood that can easily ignite and spread. So I think there are policy issues that were just poorly thought out that are impacting it. And then obviously there's climate change and sort of drying out of the land, and hot temperatures and fierce winds and all the rest of it creating a bad situation. So that's one area. And I think, part of it is regulatory, part of it is PR, and then the technology itself is actually pretty straightforward, right? All the reactors that were built in the US are based on 50s and 60s technology. And there's been 40 or 50 years of change since then, and nobody's done anything with it. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, assuming you can overcome those other hurdles, or you can start in countries like the UK or others where they've explicitly said nuclear is now going to be a new cornerstone again of their approach. The other area is longevity or anti-aging. I'm involved with a small number of companies that are BioAge and Spring Discovery are sort of two really key ones. And there's 20, 30 years of evidence that shows that aging is a biological program that can be perturbed with genetic mutations. So you can knock out a gene in C. elegans and they'll live 2 or 3 times longer. There's FDA-approved drugs that'll extend lifespan 10 to 30% across multiple organisms, mice and flies and worms and the like. So, rapamycin or metformin or other drugs. There's caloric restriction. There's all these different lines of evidence that suggest that aging is a developmental program that you can perturb. But there's very few companies actually working on translating that into drugs. And so I think that's just an enormous opportunity where there's really great things that could happen. And again, I think these two companies I mentioned, BioAge and Spring, are doing really interesting things there.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of either of them.
What would you have said?
I'm excited about Hopin. Now I'm in this time
working
on that. But usually I look a lot at SaaS companies, which is also a narrow field in itself. But my soft spot is always for things that have to do with education, which hasn't been traditionally a great space for VCs. But that's where I spent most of my early career, and still have a soft spot for that. It still sucks. I have 3 kids in elementary school doing Zoom calls all day, and it's heartbreaking to see that going on when it could be exceptional.
I think we're all hoping for the sort of diamond age style Young Ladies Illustrated primer from sort of Neil Stephenson's book, where you have a book that's interactive or a website that's interactive, and it really sort of tailors learning almost Montessori style for each individual kid. On the SaaS side, I guess the one thing that I think is sort of underdone is a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs build products for Silicon Valley companies from a SaaS perspective, and they entirely miss everything that is Fortune 500 or large traditional enterprise specific, which is a lot of potential software. And so I do think it'd be pretty amazing if somebody just did like a giant process map of every process in a large organization and asked what could be turned into code. And you could do that maybe by talking to an Accenture or Deloitte, and what do they keep building over and over and over for their customers? Why not build that into a SaaS product? Or you could do something like an analysis of what are all the components needed to run a business, and then which of those could be turned into SaaS products. Checker, the background checking API company, is a great example of that, where they built $1 billion plus company just through something that every company has to do when it hires employees. And it's kind of obvious in hindsight, but at the time it was an insight. And I feel like there's a dozen additional $1 billion plus SaaS companies that if you did that map, you'd find. So I think there's really interesting just analysis to do what nobody's doing.
I think that Freshworks has a phenomenal playbook on that they look at, okay, which software is being bought by these large enterprises, but doesn't really fit the mark. It's old, it's complicated, and build the next version of that. And they build multiple unicorns within one brand, which is pretty amazing. Which is remarkable. So speaking of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, building for Silicon Valley folks, another question that we're getting is, which is near and dear to my heart because I am in the Bay Area, is that the Bay Area is going through a transition, and it says people are moving out and relocating. Do you have a viewpoint on other areas of the US that could become the next gen cluster for startups and innovation?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think San Francisco has been especially poorly governed. And so, I think that's the place I'm seeing that most people leave, although obviously people are leaving other parts of the Bay Area too. The big question is, so it's interesting. I think that every industry eventually collapses into a handful of clusters. And that's true of the movie industry, and that's true of finance, and that's true of basically any place you name. And it's not a coincidence that every single major hedge fund, with one or two exceptions, is based in New York and Connecticut. And all the movie industry is based in Hollywood, or if you internationalize, Lagos, and for India, the moniker is Bollywood, right? Like you have these local clusters for each industry. And that's because I think there's actually enormous synergies between capital providers, so people who will fund what you're doing, people that you can hire, executives who know how to scale things, people understand distribution and channels and sales, and all that knowledge tends to reside in a single place. And there's an enormous amount of serendipity that creates these businesses, or people being close by that you can hire in to accelerate what you're doing. And so I think that after COVID, the Bay Area will snap back as being the major tech cluster in the US. So in the long run, I think the Bay Area is still the right place to be. I do think that COVID does create this interesting opportunity where it's almost a dislocation, that if you can get enough people to move to a single area, you may be able to create a mini cluster, right? And LA is kind of a mini cluster, New York is kind of a mini cluster, but I did the analysis before COVID, and I just looked at unicorn market cap, which is, of course, a backwards looking metric. And in every region, in the US, in India, in Europe, in China, and you name it, 2/3 of the market cap of private companies was aggregated in a single spot. So for us, it was the Bay Area, and then New York was maybe 1/10 of that. And then LA was maybe half of New York, and then it dropped off from there, right? And in Europe, it was mainly the UK, in London in particular. Although obviously there's pockets in Sweden and things like that, but still, it was mainly London. And you go market by market. It's Bangalore in India, and in China, it's Beijing and Shanghai. So I just think clusters exist for a reason, and they exist in every industry. Where should you go in order to try and establish a new cluster? I don't know. I mean, you could try and reinforce in LA or New York because they already have something going for them. Or you could try and create something new, like Austin, which has great people. It's a university town, which has all sorts of positive aspects, but it just still doesn't have that critical mass yet, although it has some really interesting companies. And so I think it's harder to bootstrap a new place than it is to accelerate an existing one.
Right.
It's almost like a startup, right? It's really hard to go from 0 to 1, but if something is at 1, it's easier to keep it growing.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I would love to see that analysis run again in 6 months or so, once everybody moved out to wherever they wanted to live, regardless of where the office was, and see what that map of talent looks like.
Yeah, and the beginning it'll snap back, because I think that a subset of people will be very happy with the new lifestyle and they won't want to come back. And the question is, who are the people who are going to come back to what is a suboptimal area for work? And what are the characteristics of those people? And my guess would be it's going to be the people who are prioritizing work over everything else. And that means it's going to be some of the more driven people, relative to work at least.
Wow, okay. Yeah, that's
a
great thing to do in a few quarters. So one thing you mentioned lightly but came back as a question is, if you could go more into AI technology and GPT-3 and what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think GPT-3 is like this really interesting window into what's to come, right? And so I think it's almost like the starting shot that says, let's go, and there's interesting things. I think there's a 2012 version of that in machine vision, where some of the really interesting early machine vision papers all came out right around then. And it took another 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years until you saw more and more of the applications really make it into the mainstream and the technology adapt and evolve. And again, part of that is also just some of the evolution of the underlying hardware. But all the face recognition technology and all the application of machine vision to cell biology and to other areas, I think took a while to develop. And I think we're seeing the same thing right now with natural language and GPT-3. And I think there's all sorts of really interesting places to build companies. And a lot of it, it's kind of funny because, to take a big step back, when people talk about the displacement that machine learning or AI is going to have, for some reason, they always talk about blue-collar workers. They say, oh, there's going to be a robot that's going to pick fruit. And I actually think if you look at labor costs and other things, it's going to more likely displace white-collar workers, right? It's going to be, do you really need a lawyer to mark up the same contract 50 times? Or can you have a machine do that? Do you really need a doctor, a pathologist to look at an image when a machine is going to be 10 times better at doing that, right? And so these things will take time because effectively these are large, effectively unionized labor pools. If you look at physicians, for example, they really function as a block and they make decisions as a block, and there's national bodies that set standards as a block. And so I think a lot of these tools will emerge initially as aids to help these professionals with their duties, and they'll be the final arbiter. But you can imagine over time as the data sets grow and the expertise grows and the fidelity grows, that subsets of their tasks will just be handed off to machines. And so I do think that GPT-3 is almost that version of like an ImageNet of, here's what's to come over the next 8 years.
Makes sense. Yeah, and there's some companies already doing that, right? With radiology you mentioned, and legal, and a lot of hey, we're going to help you be more effective. Instead of 3 lawyers, you'll need 2, so you don't have to hire more people. And eventually prevent you from ever getting to a 10-person legal team. You always stick to 2.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think the GPT-3 stuff is really interesting in terms of some of the less obvious, or I guess are obvious once you think of them or somebody talks about them, ideas, like, can it help people write better novels because you can prompt the machine to give you the next paragraph and it spurs a thought, or 10 next potential paragraphs so you can choose a direction, right? Or, I think there's really interesting creative ways to use the technology that NPCs, non-player characters in video games. So you can have these really rich interactions with a video game, right? And so I just think there's all these really interesting things that aren't talked about as much, but it's kind of like mobile. When I was working on the mobile team at Google, there's all sorts of things that were very obvious were going to happen in one form or another. Because you had a camera on the phone, you could text, there's all sorts of things you could do. So WhatsApp was obvious, right? In some sense, you knew that there'd be something that would replace texting. You knew there'd be something that would allow you to socially interact with photos like an Instagram. But things that were non-obvious, like Uber. I'm going to push a button and a stranger is going to show up in their car and I'm going to get in, right? And so I feel the same thing is true of GPT-3 and other ML or NLP technologies. I just think there's these unexpected things that will actually be really interesting and delightful and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I'm one of the apps I'm most grateful to is Grammarly. Super simple, but just double checks the English of English as a second language speaker and writer. Just makes me sound so much smarter and thoughtful than I really am. So,
yeah, it's a really good app. And imagine if every email that you have is automatically responded to, and then you can approve the message. So you just go to your inbox and you read all the replies, and that's something that GPT-3 could potentially do, right? And so maybe that's GPT-4, but you know what I mean? It's coming. And so I think there's really interesting automation and productivity coming, and one could argue the impact of some GPT-3 like technology on the natural language side in the enterprise, in the sort of SaaS world, is going to be dramatically larger than all the machine vision and other ML stuff that's come before it, because you're dealing with the format that really matters within companies, which is text, and all the document management and processing and extraction and understanding. And, so I do think it's going to be a very massive
sales or customer-facing interactions, which are unique, but they're not really unique at scale. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we are at time. So Nivas, let us know if we are we have time for one more. We're already.
No, so I was just, I think we have slightly overshot on time, but I was just enjoying the conversations that were going on. I was just reading through some of the comments that were coming in, right? There's someone who says, this is an awesome session. Both panelists are great. Feels like I'm getting a partial crystal ball over here. One of the best sessions, 100%. And then someone says, feels like a time machine here into the future. Thank you both, right? I was just listening to it and I kind of lost track as well. But yeah, totally. I think Travis says, I also feel like these guys could keep going for hours and keep blowing minds. So even when we reached out to Elad was super, approachable and was super kind to come on board. And Armando is, I think we always see Armando as one of our folks. So thank you so much, Armando and Elad, for this. I mean, there's no better way to finish this online summit that we've put together, and known better than both of you. So great that we were able to have both of you have this conversation. I think we've answered majority of the questions, and we're really looking forward to hosting you at other events. Thank you so much, Elad, and thank you, Armando.
Yeah.